like to thank Matthew Brown for allowing me to be here, and also on this paper I'd like to thank Jeffrey Bradshaw for looking at an early draft of it and giving me some helpful feedback on that. For those of you who weren't here in the morning to hear Matthew Brown or Jeff Bradshaw give their papers, mine will touch on a lot of the same subjects. So, you'll get some of that reiterated here. Okay. Old Testament scholar Margaret Barker, in her monograph on the temple in Jerusalem, remarked that the easiest way to enter into the world of the ancient temple is to read the Psalms and to try to imagine the setting for which they were written. The world of the first temple is considered largely inaccessible, as there are very few texts from the pre-exilic period that are available to us. This is a frustrating situation for those who long for insights into the golden age of the Israelite monarchy and the mysteries of Solomon's original temple. In this paper, I will attempt to shed some light on practices alluded to in the Psalms that may have formed part of the ritual system and theology of that first temple. The specific focus of this study comes largely from my reading of an article by Dr. Silvia Bunta. It is a man, he's Romanian, so Silvia Bunta, published in the recent Festschrift for Rachel Elior called With Letters of Light. I offer a brief summary of Dr. Bunta's argument. He argues that first Enoch should not, as per the common view, be seen as the first example of an ascent to heaven in Jewish literature. He notes that Paul Joyce of Oxford University sees Ezekiel's temple vision, starting in Ezekiel 40, as a heavenly ascent narrative, and then argues that the vision of God's kavod in Ezekiel 1 should likewise be seen as an ascent to heaven, because it also is a vision of the heavenly temple. In support of this conclusion, he asserts that the ancient Near Eastern understanding didn't differentiate between the earthly and heavenly temple. The earthly temple was the heavenly temple. The dwelling place of the gods is often associated with the tops of mountains. That the early Israelites shared a similar conceptual view, he argues, is inferred by the many biblical references, most notably in the Psalms, to God dwelling on the holy mountain. I don't agree with him 100% on his equation of the earthly and heavenly temple, but that was the argument he made. He asserts that 1 Enoch 14 and Aramaic Levi seem to refer to the top of Mount Hermon as the place to where they ascend during their visions. Associated with this view is the idea that the sanctuary was to be equated with the holy mountain, and thus with heaven. When one enters a temple on earth, says Bunta, one reaches the top of the sacred mountain and is described as entering heaven. Worshippers in the earthly temple were thought to be in heaven, standing before God. Finally, he sees the temple vision of God on his throne in Isaiah 6 as evidence supporting his claim. In essence, Isaiah ascending Mount Zion to the temple would be equivalent to him ascending into heaven. So in light of this and other evidence, I believe Bunta is correct in suggesting that visions taking place in the Jerusalem temple should be seen as essentially equivalent to visions of the heavenly temple, and that the heavenly ascent motif occurred in settings such as Ezekiel 1 that were long prior to the writing of 1 Enoch, which scholars date to about the 3rd century BC. Working from Bunta's arguments and his general conclusions, I will take the next logical step. moving the origins of the heavenly ascent motif further back beyond Ezekiel into the pre-exilic cult of the Jerusalem temple. I will argue that this type of theophanic experience, an ascent to heaven to see God, was a principal focus of the temple liturgy in monarchic times as depicted in some of the Psalms. Later heavenly ascent narratives include, among others, the following features. The visionary being taken or led on a journey upwards through the various levels of heaven, passing through a series of gates guarded by angelic beings who required adherence to moral laws and answers to questions or passwords, standing before the throne of God or seeing the divine face, and the initiation of the visionary into the heavenly order, including anointing, clothing, coronation, and enthronement. Okay, now the ritual system of the Jerusalem temple in pre-exilic times paralleled the features of these later texts in important ways, which can be outlined as follows. Pilgrims traveled to the Jerusalem temple at least 3 times a year during the major pilgrimage festivals. The pilgrimage culminated in an ascent of the Temple Mount to the temple precincts. It seems that sometimes these processions were led by the king and accompanied by the Ark of the Covenant. The procession was subjected to questioning by the keepers of the temple gates, who required a test of moral worthiness as admission. The purpose of the pilgrimage was to experience the Epiphany, or theophany, of Yahweh, to stand in the Lord's presence and to see his face. The king would have participated in further rituals, including washing, anointing, clothing, and enthronement. We will now discuss details of each of these aspects of the ritual system: pilgrimage, questioning at the temple gates, epiphany, and royal rites in turn. Whoops, it goes on the wrong slide there. The pilgrimage to appear before the Lord. At the 3 major pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the Israelites were directed to go up to appear before the Lord. In Exodus 34:23-24, we read, "Thrice in the year shall all your men children appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel." While the earliest references may not have necessarily envisioned a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they seem to imagine an ascent to an elevated sacred site. In later references, however, we do have pilgrims, and not just the men, coming from all around the region to worship the Lord at the temple in Jerusalem. In the time of the prophet Zechariah, Israel, and in fact all nations, were expected to observe this temple pilgrimage, or they would receive no rain. And that's Zechariah 14:16-19. Isaiah 30:29 seems to allude to the same type of festal temple pilgrimage. It says, "You shall have a song, as in the night when a holy festival is kept, and gladness of heart, as when one sets out to the sound of the flute to go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel." A number of psalms have a similar tone, and we can imagine that they could have been composed for or sung during this pilgrimage. Perhaps some of these were the type of song that Isaiah had in mind. Psalm 84, for example, describes a traveling group who is longing to be at the courts of the temple. I believe this is on your sheet there. "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Happy are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. As they go through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. They go from strength to strength. The God of gods will be seen in Zion." Okay, now that translation, "the God of gods will be seen in Zion," that's going from the NRSV, and it's borrowing from the Septuagint reading. The Septuagint sees this procession as an ascension using the verb anabino, which is to ascend, to go up. We should note that this pilgrimage party, singing as they go through the valley of Baca, has the objective of reaching the temple and seeing the God of gods in Zion. The psalm goes on to mention that the Lord's anointed, a reference to the king, is with this group, and they ask for a blessing upon him. Psalm 122 is another clear example. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together. To it the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. For there the thrones of judgment were set up, the thrones of the house of David. Psalm 122 is one of a body of psalms, Psalms 120 to 134, that are designated in their superscriptions as being Shir Hama'alot, or songs of ascents. These are also frequently designated as pilgrim songs. Holiday explains that these should be seen as a song sung when ascending as a pilgrim to Jerusalem, and that this group of psalms should be seen as a songbook for pilgrimage. While we don't know when all of these psalms were initially composed, Holiday sees at least Psalm 122 as well as Psalm 132 as pre-exilic. Ascending the hill of the Lord. As the pilgrims reached Jerusalem, perhaps coming along what Isaiah calls the way of holiness, that's Isaiah 35:8, they would have had to ascend to Jerusalem's mountainous perch and then climb the Temple Mount itself to get to the sanctuary. Psalm 24 asks, "Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place?" The Hebrew word Allah appears to be used as a technical term in the Hebrew Bible for ascending in procession to sacred places, including going up to the promised land of Israel and ascending the holy mountain. The directive for the thrice-yearly pilgrimage commanded the Israelites to go up to the cultic site. Psalm 118:27 appears to depict a festal procession that has come up to the great altar of the temple as part of a ritual ceremony. Psalm 68 presents very clearly a liturgical procession that is going into the temple, delineating the order in which the tribes were to proceed, which is reminiscent of Psalm 122's pilgrimage procession. Psalm 68:24-27 reads, "Your solemn processions are seen, O God, the processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them girls playing tambourines. Bless God in the great congregation, the Lord, O you who are of Israel's fountain. There is Benjamin, the least of them, in the lead, the princes of Judah in a body, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali." The vivid depictions of the great power of Yahweh that is celebrated on this occasion convey the idea that these processions were somehow imagined to be led by Yahweh himself. Verses 17 to 18 of this psalm further elucidate this picture. "With mighty chariotry, twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands, the Lord came from Sinai into the holy place. You ascended the high mount, leading captives in your train and receiving gifts from people, even from those who rebel against the Lord God's abiding there." Psalm 47, a song full of ritual allusions, depicts the people clapping, shouting, and singing because God has gone up, Allah, with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. It may be hard for us to imagine how God could have been seen as joining in a festal procession, but the idea was common in the ancient Near East, where in the great processions of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, statues representing the gods were carried along the festal highways into the gods' respective temples. I have some images here. This first one, these came from very small images, and I'm projecting them very large, so they're a bit blurry. But this depicts a Babylonian festal procession, where you see the procession going in through the Ishtar gate, and you see these barges that are being carried or pushed along. These barges would have contained statues of the gods. Here we have an Egyptian example. In Egypt, they would have had a depiction of the solar bark that the god was supposed to have been riding in. So they would have likely had the god Horus and also his wife, in barges going into the temple of Horus, or the temple of Amun, or whichever it was. This one represents the Babylon again, the procession of the god Marduk into his temple in Babylon. And we have Nebuchadnezzar greeting the god as he's brought in procession. This one may be a little difficult to make out. This one I got from Professor William Hamlin, so thank you to him. He's on the East Coast right now, but thank you to him. This is in the temple that's at Edfu, the temple of Horus, and we can see a procession of the sacred bark. Here's kind of an artist depiction of that. We have the priests carrying the sacred bark, which would have held the god, and it looks like Pharaoh leading that procession into the temple of Amun. Okay, so when we look at the Israelite tradition, all of this recalls in the Hebrew Bible the imagery of the Ark of the Covenant, representing the presence of the Lord being carried ahead of the camp of Israel during the Exodus, into battle against Israel's enemies, in procession around the city of Jericho, and being taken in procession up to Jerusalem by King David. So it seems that the Ark was serving a similar function. We read in Numbers 10:35 to 36 that whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and your foes flee before you." And whenever it came to rest, he would say, Return, O Lord, of the 10,000 thousands of Israel. Okay, so that's what we hear of when the ark was carried out in procession. Interestingly, Psalm 68 begins the way that the Numbers passage begins, with, "Let God rise up, let his enemies be scattered, let those who hate him flee before him." The 10,000 thousands of Israel is reminiscent of the similar number of chariots that Psalm 68 describes as ascending with Yahweh up the high mountain and into the temple. It would appear that Psalm 68 describes, or is meant to accompany, a procession of the ark up to the temple using the imagery of the victorious march of Yahweh leading the host of Israel at the time of the Exodus. Another song of ascents, or pilgrim song, is the pre-exilic royal psalm 132, which has long been understood to have been composed to commemorate King David's finding of the ark and its transfer to Jerusalem. The procession that David led included all of the house of Israel, following King David and the ark up to the place of the sanctuary. Okay. A similar procession was performed at Solomon's dedication of the temple, which took place at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. The fact that the chronicler has Solomon quoting part of Psalm 132 in this context may indicate that he knew of a temple tradition in which Psalm 132 was sung to accompany a reenactment of the procession of the ark into the temple. Now, whether the pilgrimage processions were accompanied by the ark or not, there seems to be an abundant evidence in the Psalms that the festival participants imagine themselves as joining Yahweh in his victorious march up to his holy dwelling place on Mount Zion. As discussed previously, because the Israelites equated the top of the mountain, and more specifically the temple, with heaven, the climb up the Temple Mount would have been imagined as an ascent to heaven. We can conclude from this that a liturgical heavenly ascent was one of the principal features of the ritual system of the first temple. Further details from the Psalms help confirm that this ritual ascent bore many more similarities to the literary accounts of heavenly ascent that are found in later texts. Passing through the gates. Psalm 118 makes references to passing through the gates of righteousness, apparently in the context of a festal procession, as we can see in verse 27. The speaker pleads, "Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it." The prophet Ezekiel, and Matthew Brown pointed this out very well this morning, the prophet Ezekiel, as part of his vision of the future ideal temple, gives in Ezekiel 44, 1-3, a description of the king entering through the vestibule of the same gate, which would be the eastern gate, that Yahweh himself had gone through. Chapter 46, 1-12 describes the king leading pilgrims through the temple gates on festal days. While these events are described for the future temple, or the ideal temple, they should likely be understood to represent previous traditions with which the prophet was familiar. I read Psalm 24 in light of the preceding considerations. The psalm starts out with a doxology, praising the Lord for his creation. The hymn parallels the similar one, which actually quotes Psalm 96, that the chronicler tells us was sung at the occasion of David's ark procession. Psalm 24, 3-4, describes someone who desires to go up to the temple. And verse 6 can be seen to indicate that this is a group of people. The NRSV has company, and Donald Perry has circle. So this is a circle that's going up to the temple. Taking the situations presented in Psalms 118, 132, and the vision of Ezekiel into consideration, the life setting that we can imagine here for Psalm 24 is a procession of pilgrims led by an individual, likely the king, who are accompanying Yahweh, perhaps represented by the ark, up to the temple. We can picture the procession proceeding up the holy mountain until they reach the temple gates, where they are required to stop. In verse 3, we hear the questions: "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in the holy place?" At the gates, there were likely priests. We can see that from various places in the Bible. There were priests, and later they were Levites. I won't cite the scriptures, but these priests were stationed there as gatekeepers. There appears to be a question and answer dialogue that takes place, plausibly between the processional party and the gatekeepers. In verses 3-5, the qualifications for entry to the temple are established. As Craig Broyles notes, the qualifications are ethical and not sacral in nature. So it's not just that you had to have washed yourself and cleansed yourself before you got to the temple. These were moral requirements. We see in Psalm 118 that it is only the righteous that are permitted to pass through the gate. While Psalm 24 appears to have an abbreviated list of requirements, we just get a few there, Psalm 15, as mentioned by Brother Brown as well, gives 10 qualifications, reminiscent of the Decalogue given at Sinai, which can be similarly viewed as moral requirements for beginning an ascension of the holy mountain to stand in Yahweh's presence. Entrance to the temple precincts involved the revelation of moral requirements in the form of covenants from God, the acceptance of these on the part of the worshipers, and confirmation to the gatekeepers that these requirements were being met. Verse 5 seems to be spoken by the gatekeepers, or accompanying priests, declaring the blessings promised to those who fulfill the requirements. Verse 6 appears to be an indication from the pilgrims that they do indeed comply with the requirements. After having confirmed that the pilgrims are living the covenantal requirements, there is a call for the gates to be opened so that the King of Glory may come in. It is interesting to note that Broyles interprets the use of the name Yahweh in response to the questions of Psalm 24, 8 and 10 to signify that the name of God is used as a password through the gates. Those are his words. Furthermore, he argues that the name King of Glory is used here as a new name. He assumes this because the respondents in verses 8 and 10 appear to not know the name. They say, "Who is this King of Glory?" And then you get the response. Okay? So we have possibly a password, the name of God, and a new name being used to go through the gates. If we take it to represent a similar context, Psalm 118 seems to indicate that the procession has been allowed to go through the gates, has received a blessing from the Lord, and now makes its way to the altar of the temple. Mo Winkle saw the festal procession, as indicated in verse 27, as approaching and perhaps circling the altar. As previously noted, Perry sees Psalm 24:6 as describing the processional group as a circle. He's reading dur instead of dor. Dor is usually interpreted as generation, but he reads circle instead of generation. He notes that this could be a reference to a religious prayer circle in which the participants inquire of or pray to the Lord in hopes to see his face. Okay? Psalm 24:6, if we follow the Septuagint, says that this group is going to the temple to seek to see the face of the God of Jacob. Which leads us to the next topic, the Epiphany, seeing the Lord in his temple. The Psalms depict the purpose of the pilgrimage to the temple not to be simply to appear before the Lord, but as previously mentioned, Psalm 84:7 can be interpreted, reading the Septuagint, "Aphthesitai ho theos," as declaring that the expectation is to be able to see the Lord. Some scholars have argued that the injunction in Exodus 34:24 to appear in the presence of the Lord may have originally read to see the face of the Lord. Margaret Barker has argued for that. While the Masoretic text has the nifal imperfect of the verb ra'ah, to see, meaning you will be seen or you will appear, some argue that the original reading would have had a call imperfect, you will see. Holliday suggests that the text may have been changed for theological reasons. The idea of going to the holy place to see the Lord, or that the Lord would make an appearance at a cultic site, is certainly not foreign to the Hebrew Bible. I've already mentioned the visions of Ezekiel and Isaiah. There are many others worthy of mention. King Solomon in 1 Kings 3 goes up to the high place of Gibeon to offer sacrifice, and the Lord appears to him in a dream. 1 Samuel 3:21, we read, "The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh." The prophet Malachi, in Malachi 3, in language reminiscent of some of the Psalms, envisioned that the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come to his temple, and asked, but who can abide the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appeareth? Of course, that harkens back to Brother Bradshaw's presentation. The priestly instructions for sacrifice recorded in Leviticus 9, 3-6 declare, and say to the people of Israel, take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, yearlings without blemish for a burnt offering, for today the Lord will appear to you. So we get this throughout the Bible, connected with cultic practices. In the story of the children of Israel at Sinai, while most of the people of Israel are required to remain at a distance from the foot of the holy mountain, a number of individuals are chosen to ascend up the mountain together with Moses and Aaron. That's a bit blurry there. We read in Exodus 24, 9 to 11, then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, again the verb Allah, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. God did not lay his hand upon the chief men of the people of Israel. Also they beheld God, and they ate and drank. As an important aside, I would mention that James Tabor, among others, has noted that Exodus 24 bears a number of similarities to the heavenly ascent genre. He explains, Moses, or alternatively Moses, Aaron, and the 70 elders, ascends the mountain, enters the presence of God, the realm of the divine. He is given revelation in the form of heavenly tablets, then descends back to the mortal realm. He becomes a semi-divine figure, eating and drinking in the divine presence, and returning from the mountain with his face transformed like an immortal. We may also note that the Exodus and Sinai experiences are an important theme in the Psalms, as can be seen, for example, in Psalm 68, 81, 95, 99, 114, and others. Mowinkle and others saw the festal procession to the temple, to the Temple Mount as a reliving of the journey through the wilderness to experience the theophany at Mount Sinai. The principal paradigm of these texts is that God would appear in the described cultic situations. Klaus Siebold sees the theophany of God as one of the key recurring features of the Psalms and explains that the theophany must have been a cultic event, and that these relevant Psalms reveal a tradition of an event experienced and passed on in worship. He argues that the oldest of these texts, like Psalm 18, 68, 97, record the pre-exilic existence of such liturgical traditions, as do the references outside the Psalter, such as Isaiah 6 and Deuteronomy 33. To cite just a few further examples of this theme, we can read in Psalm 17:15, as for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied, beholding your form. Psalm 11:7 has, for the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. Psalm 27:4 puts the vision of the Lord explicitly in the context of the temple. One thing I asked of the Lord that I will seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. Siebold sees in Psalm 63, as in Psalm 18, evidence of an Advent celebration in which the appearance of Yahweh was dramatically represented. I have seen you in the sanctuary. This is quoting Psalm 63. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and glory. That's in verse 2. This psalm seems to place the king in the setting of the Holy of Holies of the temple, experiencing a theophany of Yahweh. And I've reused an image that Brother Bradshaw used earlier. But the language of so many of the Psalms, especially if we attempt to view them in a cultic setting, combined with the numerous other biblical expressions of expectation of theophany in connection with cultic ritual, lead us to conclude that the principal goal of one or more of the pilgrimage festivals in pre-exilic times was to ascend to the temple so that one could experience the theophany and see the face of the Lord, however this was imagined or ultimately realized. Enthronement in heaven. Another key feature of many later heavenly ascent narratives is that after the visionary has beheld the deity on his throne, the visionary himself is enthroned, either on the throne of God or on a similar throne beside God's. To cite a relevant example, later Jewish traditions understood Moses, when he ascended Mount Sinai, as having seen God on his throne, and then having seen himself enthroned in heaven and set to rule as God's vice-regent on earth. So there you get Michelangelo's depiction of Moses on a throne. Excuse me. In Exegage of Ezekiel the Tragedian, starting in line 67, Moses is made to say, I had a vision of a great throne on the top of Mount Sinai, and it reached to the folds of heaven. A noble man was sitting on it, with a crown and a large scepter in his left hand. He beckoned to me with his right hand, so I approached and stood before the throne. He gave me the scepter and instructed me to sit on the great throne. Then he gave me a royal crown and got up from the throne. I beheld the whole earth all around and saw beneath the earth and above the heavens. Okay, this is a depiction of Hiram, king of Byblos. That's a Phoenician city in modern-day Lebanon. And he is depicted as seated on a cherub throne, and that seems to be common for kings in the ancient Near East. So this sequence of being enthroned on God's throne was arguably a part of the pre-exilic temple ritual. We read in 1 Chronicles 29:23, Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king instead of David his father, and prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. The idea that when the king was enthroned, he was being seated on the cherubim throne of Yahweh seems to be an early pre-exilic concept. With that in mind, we can then get a broader perspective of the pre-exilic coronation rituals by looking at the relevant Psalms. Psalm 2, 6-7 reads, Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. We can interpret this passage, of course, to refer to a prophecy of Christ, the Messiah in the future, but also to refer to God having taken the king up to the top of the Temple Mount, which would have been equivalent to an ascent to heaven, and having enthroned him there. The Lord gives a decree to the king, announcing him to be the Son of God. Now, this is a depiction of a model temple that was discovered in Moab. And I got this from William Hamblin as well. This depicts a dual throne. You can see the throne's kind of divided into two. And, some scholars think that this must have depicted a throne for God and his consort, the Heavenly Mother. But Professor Hamblin has also said that this could represent God on one throne and the king sat at his right hand. Okay? And we see that in Psalm 110. Psalm 110:1 has the Lord directing the king to sit at his right hand. Okay? So we get perhaps the king sitting on the Lord's throne, but perhaps it's at the right hand of the Lord on the same throne. The king has previously been anointed. Just as the visionary in the ascent narratives is described as being washed, anointed, clothed, and vested with the experience, we learn from the Bible that the coronation of kings followed a similar pattern. The king was washed and purified, likely at the spring of Gihon. He was anointed on the head with a perfumed olive oil that was kept in a horn in the sanctuary. He was clothed in robes and also wore a priestly apron called the ephod, a sash, and also a diadem or a headdress. Finally, the king was consecrated as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's Psalm 110:4. Just as Moses was understood in later Jewish writings to have been deified by his experience on Mount Sinai, this may very well have been ritually true for the Israelite kings as well. Margaret Barker describes a second temple ritual in which the high priest, Simon, emerges from the temple and is treated as if he were Yahweh. She notes, citing Ben Sira 50:17, "When he emerged from the Holy of Holies," this is the high priest, "he was like the morning star, like the sun shining on the temple. His very presence made the court of the temple glorious. When he had poured the libation, the trumpet sounded, and all the people together fell to the ground upon their faces to worship their Lord." And then Barker comments, "The most natural way to read this is that they were worshiping the high priest, or rather Yahweh, whom he represented." This second temple ritual expression involving the high priest as the representative of Yahweh should likely be understood to be an example of post-exilic borrowing of pre-exilic royal rights, attributing, in the absence of the monarchy, to the high priest functions previously attached to the figure of the king. Turning again to the narrative of Solomon's coronation in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 20, "And David said to all the congregation, 'Now bless the Lord your God.' And all the congregation blessed the Lord God of their fathers, and bowed down their heads, and worshiped the Lord and the king." Very curious wording there. If the throne of the Lord that Solomon was enthroned on refers to the cherubim throne in the Holy of Holies, then a situation very much like that described for the high priest Simon, where he emerged from the temple with the early morning light, causing his glorious raiment to gleam brilliantly, likely ensued with the king. Zechariah 12:8 informs us that ideally the monarchs of the house of David were to be like the angel of the Lord, representing God before the people. This is likely what was believed to have been the king's status after he was set on God's holy hill, enthroned at his right hand, and declared to be the Son of God. Ritually, he had ascended into heaven to stand before the throne of God and was enthroned there. After this experience, the king would have been seen as having been transformed into an angelic messenger, the representative of Yahweh. Oops,